Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we're talking with Professor Danielle Lupton, the author of Reputation for Resolve, How Leaders Signal Determination in International Politics. Professor Lupton is a professor at Colgate University and earned her PhD from Duke University in 2014. If you've followed the academic debate around international relations, you know that reputation does not matter at all. Unless, of course, reputation is the most important factor in determining what's going on. This is one of those enormously frustrating issues in international relations where there are powerful positions supported by evidence on both sides, and yet both sides seem to be talking past each other. In her new book, Professor Lupton addresses this disagreement head-on and offers an interesting solution that takes into account factors that many of the proponents on both sides of the debate have previously ignored. I will also mention to our listeners that Professor Lupton is a friend of mine and that I met her a couple of years ago, first at an International Studies Association convention where she had organized a panel on civil-military relations. She was presenting a really interesting paper on the behavior of veterans in Congress in terms of overseeing war that had fascinating research. And I was presenting a paper on the civil-military relations of military cyber operations that had a lot of punctuation. My paper was so strong, in fact, that the discussant, when I had said, this isn't my main dissertation project, said, I'm really relieved to hear that. But despite that inauspicious position, Professor Lupton has been a great friend and mentor and supporter through my academic career, and it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction, Doyle, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the listeners as well for joining us today.
So can you start out by summarizing for our listeners what the argument of your book is?
Sure. So the main debate that I am interjecting myself into is this question of, do reputations actually matter in international politics? Why or why not? And I actually pushed that debate a little bit further. And I'm also really interested in this question of how do reputations form to begin with? Because I really think that we need to take a step back in the debate and think less about, what are the effects of reputations? Because we can't understand that question until we understand fully how reputations form. So as you mentioned, there's a large debate between reputation skeptics who argue that reputations, as we traditionally think about them as being informed by an actor's past behavior, don't really form. And so when I am making assessments of another actor's future behavior, I'm not going to look at what they've done in the past or something about their internal characteristics. What I'm going to look at instead is how much power do they have and what is their interest in the issue under dispute. And this group of reputation skeptics, most prominently led by Press, Mercer, and Hoff, look primarily at qualitative evidence, and they show that, look, reputations don't really matter. On the other side, there's reputation supporters, and they're actually looking primarily at quantitative or large N statistical data, and they find that actually, no, reputations or past actions do matter. So you have these two sides of this debate. This debate has been raging for decades, and we haven't actually seen a lot of common ground coming in. And so the primary argument I make is that what if it's not about past actions versus capability and interest? What if it's actually kind of about both of these things? Isn't it possible that both past actions can matter, but so too can the context in which actors interact with each other? And the way that I bridge these two arguments, or two sides of the debate, is that I shift the focus from the reputations of states, like the United States, to the reputations of individual world leaders. And I argue that reputations adhere not only to states, but that individual leaders can also acquire personal reputations for resolve that then not only inform the reputations of their states more generally, but that also drive their international bargaining behavior, as well as how other leaders in other states react to that individual. And then in the book, I go into a pretty nuanced argument about how these reputations form over time, which I would be happy to talk more with you about. But that's kind of the main crux and the main argument of the book.
Sure. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about the argument is that it brings people back into politics. It doesn't treat states as black boxes, as entities that operate. It recognizes that states are led by people and that people interact with others. And just like you and I interact on the basis of our reputation, so do world leaders interact on the basis of reputation. I really like that. Let me ask that, what caused you to want to take this on? I think often if you're looking, was this your dissertation topic developed into a book?
Yes, it was. Yes.
So, I mean, I'm curious because I guess, sort of one of the pieces of advice on a dissertation topic is not to necessarily take on the biggest scholars out there and to not take on an intractable debate. It's not necessarily a recipe for getting done quickly and well. You did a terrific job with it, but I'm curious, what caused you to choose this topic?
I was a graduate student in Alex Downs' international security course, and we had read Daryl Press's Calculating Credibility. And I was really intrigued by the concepts about reputation, and Press's book really challenged my preconceived notions about reputations. So I walked into Alex's office. I was working on my prospectus, and I said, I think I want to write about reputations, but I don't think this is actually a story about states. I really think this is a story about leaders. And no one at that time had looked at that. And so I really had this puzzle that I really wanted to work through, particularly integrating the research on reputation, but also then integrating the research on foreign policy analysis. And I just felt this incredible intellectual curiosity about kind of teasing out this counterintuitive puzzle that Press and others had identified. And so what I would say to anyone who's thinking about choosing a dissertation topic is pick something that is really kind of gets at you in that core intellectual spot where it just nags at you and you just really want to know the truth, because it's not just a 5-year process, it's a 10-year process if you're going to be writing a book. So that's how the entire thing started. Was I read this book by Press, and I really wanted to dig in and really learn more about what was really happening with reputations.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me as interesting is that in a blurb on the book, Professor Todd Sexer says that your theory upends the conventional wisdom. And one of the things that struck me is it kind of highlights the distinction between academic international relations, where there is a settled conventional wisdom, and sort of the more common view of politics, where it does seem almost like it might be conventional wisdom that people matter more than just institutions and reputations. And so I think I really appreciate the way that you took something that is on one level common sense, but you didn't treat it as something trivial.
This is actually how I frame the puzzle of the book, right? Is we have all this evidence that leaders think their reputations matter. And then we have this quote unquote consensus that reputations don't matter, which again, I would argue is not a consensus within the literature. And so the way I frame the book is, are leaders wrong to believe their reputations matter? And ultimately I find and argue that no, they are not wrong or foolish to think that their reputations matter.
So you make a point in the first chapter of distinguishing between resolve and credibility. And I'd like to explore that distinction a little bit, but I'd like to add a couple of other terms as well, because it strikes me that just as resolve and credibility are closely related but not the same, so too reputation is something that has to be unpacked a little bit. And credibility and resolve are both closely linked to the notion of deterrence. So if you could talk about how reputation, resolve, credibility, and deterrence are interrelated, I think that'd be great for our listeners.
Oh, yes, my pleasure. So I like to use the analogy of a poker game. So if we're thinking about resolve is all about an actor's willingness to pay costs to get what they want. So how much hurt and pain are you willing to endure in order to get what you want? As opposed to credibility is how believable do I think your actions are? So resolve is a component of credibility, but other factors also influence whether or not something is deemed credible. So to get back to the poker analogy, which I promised, is that we can think about resolve. One could try to signal their resolve based on how big their bet is, right? So, you're sending out signals about how much pain you're willing to incur based on how you're betting. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be viewed as credible because perhaps you have a reputation for bluffing. Maybe in past hands you've bluffed or not, right? I think that it's really important that we recognize, as you said, that resolve and credibility are very closely linked, but that we do need to disentangle these two concepts. And I think another really good way to think about this is in terms of synonyms. So resolve, we might think about things like firmness and toughness, determination, whereas credibility, we might think about things like believability And so these become really important when we start thinking about reputation. And that's because we really need to recognize that actors do not have a singular reputation. No, you have reputation for what? Is it a reputation for resolve, a reputation for credibility? Anne Sartori looks at a reputation for honesty, alliance credibility, and the list goes on and on and on. Technically speaking, reputations are perceptions that others hold about us that are based on our past actions. So it isn't actually a reputation if it isn't somehow rooted in something you've done in the past. And this, I think, it makes a lot of sense if we think about how we colloquially use reputation, just in kind of an everyday way. So when we think about reputations, we, one, need to recognize that it's rooted in past actions, and two, we need to be really clear about reputation for what. Okay. And this all comes into deterrence because the logic is that if you have a reputation for being resolute, if you have a reputation for being firm, and if you have a reputation for being credible, so following, for making threats that you're willing to follow through on, again, that statement itself, I think, is conflating a little bit resolve and credibility because they are very closely linked, then you're more likely to be effective at your deterrence or coercion compellence efforts. So the idea here is that if you want to be a good coercer, or if you want to be able to stave off future threats, you need to have a reputation for, one, being willing to incur a lot of pain, because otherwise your threats aren't going to be believable. You're not going to be credible.
That makes sense. And I guess I sort of think of reputation and deterrence as the parentheses outside credibility and resolve, and that reputation and deterrence occur in the mind of someone else, whereas credibility and resolve are inherent characteristics of the actor.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good way to think about it too, and a really good way to frame it, right? And that also brings us back to another issue, which is that, whenever we think about reputation is completely subjective in the sense that I might think that you have a certain reputation, but someone else might have a different view of your reputation based on their interactions with you. And here too, as you mentioned, it's really important to recognize that, and this is where I think signaling comes in. Signaling is really important, right? I might have a sense of how resolute I am, but if I'm not adequately signaling that to you, in your mind, your perception of my resolve might not accurately reflect what my inherent resolve is. So absolutely, we need to think about reputation as being this perception-oriented, cognitive heuristic in many ways about how actors make decisions.
And, when you're describing that, I actually started thinking of the scene from The Princess Bride, where Vizzini is sitting across from the man in black and narrating his thought process about which vial has the poison. But that also raises an interesting point, is that no matter what someone else actually thinks of you, if you are shaping your actions because you're concerned about what they think of you, then reputation matters, even if they don't have a concern about it one way or another. That gets a little bit meta, but it becomes a point where when reputation and concern for reputation drives the action of leaders, then reputation does actually affect action.
This is a really interesting way to think about it. And actually, I think this is really fascinating because this also in some ways flips the arguments of reputation skeptics a little bit on their head. Because one of the arguments reputation skeptics make is, well, leaders think their reputations matter, but because others aren't acting on their past actions, therefore reputations don't matter. But you're absolutely right that, leaders are concerned. They are egoistic, if we want to put it that way, or legacy, quote unquote, concerns about, why individuals are acting, that can then inform their behavior. I think this also, though, can help bring up some interesting questions about when reputations matter or not in terms of how other actors view you. And that I have heard some arguments, particularly with more recent political events, that maybe perhaps part of why, Obama was acting the way he was, or Trump is acting the way he is purely out of legacy concerns. And so I think in many ways, we might also consider, in some ways, flipping that as well, and wondering about, do those concerns over reputation therefore actually undermine an actor's credibility? Because if I think that you are acting strongly or resolutely only because you're concerned about, your personal legacy, then maybe you're not really resolute. You're just trying to put on a good show.
It's disturbingly like our concerns in high school about what we wore and who thought we were popular, isn't it?
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about the concepts and the structure of your argument. Let's talk about how it is that you support your argument. I really like the way in which you take both a quantitative approach using a survey experiment, and then you take a look at case studies. But let's talk about the survey first. How do you use a survey to answer questions about reputation?
So actually, I think that surveys are the perfect instrument for this, because reputation is really difficult to capture in your traditional large N kind of quantitative work. And that is because reputations are perceptions. So how do you get a proxy variable in a large N data set for that perception? Now, I have done this in other work, in a piece that was published in the Journal of Global Security Studies, using a couple different proxies for reputation. Others as well have done this. But it really is kind of like a one-step removed argument. So actually, the nice thing about surveys is that you can go in and you can directly ask people their views on how they perceive a leader given the different circumstances they're exposed to in the survey. Now, the bigger question about surveys is really the external validity issue, right, and the generalizability issue. So if we want to study world leaders, but we don't have access to world leaders, how can we use surveys effectively? And the main argument there coming out of the foreign policy analysis literature is that if we're thinking about how people think, if we're really making a cognitive argument and we're really making an argument about perceptions, then we should be able to take our results and our causal mechanisms and apply those to people across the board. Now, we want to also be really careful, though, that when we interpret that evidence, we need to keep in mind that the incentive structures of participants are not the same as the incentive structures of real world leaders. So that's why in the experiments, what I try to do here is really pinpoint those causal mechanisms, but be careful in tempering my claims about what this means for how actual leaders will act. And that's also why I think it was really critical for me in the book to do a multi-methods approach, to combine these experiments and historical case studies to demonstrate that the causal mechanisms that I find in the experiments are indeed supported by the historical case studies as well.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit earlier. I absolutely love your case selection here. I think it is it is clever, it is insightful, it takes advantage of two very distinctly different leaders, and it puts into place all of the elements there, because as I'm sure you'll discuss here in a moment, part of your theory argues that timing matters, that the actions that a leader takes early in their tenure have a disproportionate effect on establishing their reputation. So rather than me describing it, tell us a little bit about the cases that you chose, why you chose them, and what we found from them.
I think there are two different ways that we can study this development of leader-specific reputations. One is we can look at how does a single leader's reputation form over time across repeated events. And that's really important because that really tests the causal mechanisms of my argument about the specific, precise ways in which these reputations develop from, day one of a leader's tenure. But we also, though, need to keep in mind that perhaps what a leader's predecessor has done might then influence how that leader is perceived, especially if reputations are rooted in states and not leaders. So there's also the alternative way to think about this would be the leadership transition approach. So so you have leader A, then you have a leadership transition. Now you have a new leader, leader B, how those reputations compare. And so I follow that, comparing the single leader to the leader transition approach in the experiments, but I also do that in the case studies. So what I do in the case studies, spoiler alert, is I look at Nikita Khrushchev and I hold Nikita Khrushchev, the observer, constant. And I say, okay, how did Khrushchev view Dwight D. Eisenhower's reputation? How did that evolve over time? And then how did Khrushchev view Kennedy's reputation? And how much of his perception of Kennedy and Eisenhower's resolve was based on what they, i.e. each individual president, did during their own tenure versus structural factors or domestic politics or holdovers from Eisenhower into Kennedy. And what I find very, very strongly is clear evidence that Eisenhower's reputation formed separately from his predecessor Truman, and so too did Kennedy's reputation form separately from Eisenhower's. And two, I also find that there's this really critical period, especially for Kennedy's reputation development, very early in his tenure, where he makes some very critical mistakes about signaling his resolve that undermine his reputation. And it's difficult for him to recoup his reputation moving forward, particularly in his response to the Berlin crisis. And that ultimately contributes in part to why we end up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also found some really cool stuff on the Eisenhower case study, especially regarding the ability of other actors within administration to acquire their own reputation, like Dulles acquiring his own reputation. And I really, really enjoyed the historical analysis there. I was able to go to the Eisenhower archives for a pretty extended period of time and really dig into that. And archival research, I love survey experiments, but archival research is just this wonderful, visceral, rich, textual experience that I really, really enjoy.
Well, and what's terrific also is that this is a period that is richly documented by the participants as well as by very close observers. And Nikita Khrushchev is a terrific audience to use because he was in the habit, perhaps from his early dealings with Stalin and self-preservation, of recording his thoughts in his diary, and then those diaries are available, as well as his memoir, where he seemed to be very frank in his observations. And so you have an unusual level of access to the thought process of a foreign leader in this case.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I think is really fascinating about Khrushchev is that what he writes at the time is very different from what he says in his memoirs later. So I think this is a really good lesson, especially for Kennedy. He's very dismissive of Kennedy initially. And then later, after the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't go so well for him, he kind of has this revisionist history about how he saw Kennedy. And, I always knew he was tough. No, that's not what the documents say at the time. And so I think this is actually a really cautionary tale about how we use memoirs, which I know will not surprise historians or people who are, really well versed in qualitative research. But I think it is this interesting, note of caution. And the other thing that I think is really important about these case studies is that these are similar case studies to what reputation skeptics have used to dismiss the value of reputations. But they've been looking at it primarily, for example, Darrell Press, from the American side. So how do the Americans evaluate Soviet perceptions of resolve? But certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis is viewed as the classic example of reputation brinkmanship.
So I'd like to pull us out of the cases you use in the book and talk about a case that you alluded to in our introduction, because I think this is a really fascinating application of your theory to more contemporary events. And this is the period in Syria when President Obama declared a red line over the use of chemical weapons, and then did not use force in response to evidence of their use, instead finding a different way to resolve the conflict and, at least in theory, to remove chemical weapons from the equation. So what does your theory about reputation for resolve tell us about this? Is it consistent?
So I think that there's a couple different issues at play here. So one thing my theory would tell us is that we need to look at when in a leader's administration a threat is made. If it's made very early in a leader's administration, it's going to have more impact and power over one's reputation than one made later in a leader's administration. So in that regard, one could argue that because the Syria crisis didn't happen immediately when Obama took office, perhaps there are other factors at play that affect issues of resolve and credibility. I do think, though, that one of the main takeaways from my book in terms of policy making is, two of the main takeaways, I think, are one, your words matter, not just your actions, right? So rhetoric matters for reputation. And two, along with that, you really don't want to overpromise in terms of your threats. And this is actually one area where I think Obama did something well, and one area where I think he did it poorly. So on the positive side, one could argue that Obama didn't overpromise because his red line threat didn't actually promise anything. I think this is something that people forget. Obama didn't make this clear threat about what would happen, right? What the consequences would be. It was kind of this vague, ambiguous threat. But he also didn't follow through, and he tried to kind of pin it on Congress. Well, look, Congress wouldn't let me do it. And I don't think that is effective either. I think that on the whole, my research would suggest, and I argue this in the book, particularly in the conclusion, that the way that Obama handled the Syrian red line was not conducive to fostering or reinforcing a reputation for resolute action. And actually I have a current project that I'm working on that extends from the book, primarily out of the case studies. And that is, how does the emotionality or ambiguity/precision of a threat influence threat credibility as well as perceptions of resolve? So this is something that I'm working on right now to really tease out further.
Well, the other issue that the question of the Syrian red line raises, and it's an issue, again, you touch on in the book, is whether democracies have some unique concerns because of their policymaking process and because of the question of audience costs. What do you think about that?
Well, my surveys show that it doesn't really matter. So we have this notion that democracies should, in theory, be better at signaling their resolve and their threats should be more credible. And when I say democracies, I also mean democratic leaders, because they face more potential punishment domestically from backing down from explicit threats. But what I find in these survey experiments is that when I include a regime type as a factor in the treatments, it doesn't really matter. And I thought, well, perhaps this is because the survey participants don't really understand the distinction between democracy and non-democracy. But when I look at the open-ended responses to participants, I find that actually they're really quite sophisticated. So people who receive the democratic treatment want to know things like, what was the public opinion level? What did the legislature have to say about this? What about party politics? So they really did understand what was going on here in terms of the mechanism. I also find evidence from my case studies that the fact that Kennedy was a Democrat and Eisenhower was a Republican really had very little, if any, bearing on Khrushchev's perceptions of either president's resolve. So I think that to a certain extent, the importance of regime type is overstated here, with one key caveat. That's for international audiences and outside observers and their reputations. That's very different, I think, than domestic audiences and your reputation with your domestic public, which is also something that I have a new survey experiment project that is looking at.
And that actually moves to a more contemporary issue of reputation and threats. And here I'm thinking, and again, you allude to it briefly in the book, of President Trump's approach to North Korea early in his term, in which he made very strongly worded threats that then apparently sort of were backpedaled from or went away in one way or another. What's the effect of that on reputation for resolve?
It's bad. To put it as simply as possible. Look, one of the main findings from the book in terms of policy implications is that if you're going to make strong, bombastic, bold, harsh threats, you have to be prepared to follow through. And Trump has repeatedly made threats against North Korea, using it what I would view as very emotionally strong rhetoric, and he has not followed through on that rhetoric. Now, there have been times where Trump has followed through on other issues. But on North Korea specifically, he has a poor track record here. And I do think that it undermines his reputation for resolve. I also think, though, that we are beyond the stage where Trump internationally is able to salvage his reputation. Karen Yarny-Milo also wrote a foreign affairs piece about, after credibility, arguing that Trump has, diminished his international credibility. And I think that's true. And I don't think it has anything to do with Trump's political affiliation. This is not a never Trumper kind of issue. This is that the president's strategy of employing kind of what he said, this Mad Men Nixon-esque, it's actually Schelling, right? strategy does not work. If anything, it signals that you don't know what you want to do and that you're not sure how much you're willing to pay. And it is not a sound strategy if you want to establish a reputation for resolute action.
So does that ultimately come down to a question of credibility?
Absolutely, it does. Because again, those two things, right, are intertwined. If you signal to someone that you're not willing to pay the costs associated with your threats, then by extension, your threat is not going to be believable. Absolutely.
That makes sense. And yeah, that does create a challenge with the whole sort of notion of the rationality of irrationality. And one of the things that is both fascinating and a little perverse when you get into the deterrence literature are all the permutations of the games of chicken that they come up with where, okay, yes. I threw away the steering wheel, I handcuffed myself to the car, I did all these things. And I think these things are wonderful thought experiments, but much more challenging when you place them into the actual context of international relations.
Yes, absolutely. And, it's not just my work that shows this. We have kind of like this rush and wave of evidence. So, Sexer and Furman have work that shows this. Roseanne McManus has been working through this issue as well. And kind of the consensus that we seem to be coming to here is that this doesn't, at least for international audiences, it doesn't work. I think that's a different question of, does that play to one's base? Sure. But, who do you want to try to influence here? If you really want to influence international actors and adversaries or even allies, that is not a sound that is not a sound strategy.
So there's going to be a successor to President Trump, whether that occurs in 2020 or 2024. How does that successor go about building their reputation for resolve?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Step 1, do not make threats on things that you do not know you will be willing to, and key caveat here, able to stand firm on. Step 2, when you do feel it is necessary to make threats, you do not need to make these big hand-waving, emotional threats. Calm, collected, deliberate threats, my work shows, are more effective. Let me give you an example. Eisenhower versus Kennedy. Eisenhower had a strategy beyond the hidden hand presidency of working through Dulles, even on his own. Eisenhower had a strategy of deliberate, calm, collected responses. Part of this has to do with timing. So, for example, in response to the Berlin Ultimatum, the Eisenhower administration purposely waited to respond because they felt that an immediate response would actually signal that they were perturbed by Khrushchev's ultimatum, and that had gotten under their skin, and they didn't want to signal that. They wanted to signal, I'm in charge here. Right? Contrast that with Kennedy, who uses quite, bombastic, emotional, and what historian Michael O'Brien says is almost jingoistic rhetoric at key points. Suggests to Khrushchev that his feathers are getting ruffled, and that strong, bombastic rhetoric then ups the ante about the expectation of how you're going to respond. So you now have to respond even more harshly in order to communicate your resolve. The analogy I like to use about this is that if your child is throwing a temper tantrum, what's going to signal that you're not going to put up with it more? Calmly responding to your child and saying, no, we're not going to do that. No. Or also getting really worked up and starting yelling and screaming at the child, or even a dog, right? If you think about pet ownership for people who don't have children, right? They always say that when you discipline a dog, you want to, again, I want to make sure that the audience knows I am not comparing pets to children, but you similar things with discipline, right? Especially with animals, you want to be calm and clear. The minute that they feel your tension and your energy, they're going to respond in kind. So I think you want to have that clear, calm, collected energy, and it needs to be deliberate. That's how I think you establish reputation for resolve.
There's an anecdote, I think it's in David Lake's Hierarchy in International Relations, but I may be misremembering it, but I just remember a statement to the effect of, a gun may be very useful to a policeman in maintaining order, but it's much less useful to a kindergarten teacher in maintaining order in the classroom. And tempering the threats, whether they're implicit or explicit, to the audience in such a way that they're credible and believable seems to make a big difference.
Well, absolutely. And also, I think, tempering the threats to the issue at stake is also real. And I think this is really, really tricky, right? Because the logic might suggest that if you really overreact on something very small, well, wouldn't that actually demonstrate your resolve really strongly? And I'm not sure that is necessarily true, particularly given, some of the work that has come out of the case studies. I think it is a really fine balancing act here. And I think this is also where presidential advisors and where experience becomes really important.
You have an interesting example in the book about the choice of issue on which you try to stake your reputation that involves Indian Prime Minister Nehru. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that Nehru did in 1960 was he purposely rejected China's offer of compromise over the Aksai Chin because he was trying to demonstrate this reputation for firmness. And That actually, I think, can be a very bold strategy because you don't know how the other side is going to respond. We have to remember that, bargaining and reputation is this quote unquote, at least a two-player game. It's not just you. It's also how the other side is also going to respond to what you do.
So, one of the things that I love very much about this topic is that while it can be wrapped up in academic jargon, it becomes very familiar when you start contextualizing it because it's ultimately about interpersonal relationships. It's about how we deal with people as individuals and as groups. So what are the big lessons that I should take away from your book about what to expect about how leaders are going to behave if they're concerned about reputation for resolve?
It can actually be a bit difficult to interpret from my work about how they're going to behave as opposed to how they should behave, right? So I do think that my work speaks prescriptively in that regard. But I do think that one of the important things that my book shows is that I think sometimes we tend to forget that international diplomacy is, as you said, conducted between people. These personal relationships matter, and not just the relationships, but the perceptions that these high-level elite decision makers hold about each other are really critical here. I actually think this is something that has been demonstrated in Trump's relationship with American allies in Europe in particular, even with Canada, right? The more we keep having these summits and there's always some kind of, kerfuffle or taboo that's broken. And I do think that you see this importance of interpersonal relationships playing out there, right? I think the other important thing to consider here too is that these personal relationships and these perceptions that leaders hold about each other also influence crisis bargaining because they influence the strategies and tactics that leaders use going into bargaining. Case in point, Khrushchev went into the Vienna summit with Kennedy with a very negative perception of Kennedy's resolve based on two things. One, Kennedy really vacillated in his Berlin policy when he came into office, and that signaled to Khrushchev that he wasn't really Kennedy, wasn't really sure what he wanted to do about Berlin. And two, the Bay of Pigs debacle. Now, granted, Bay of Pigs was not directly about Soviet-U.S. relations, but it did demonstrate Kennedy's lack of commitment and firmness. Now, Kennedy knows this going into the Vienna summit, and he knows that he has to put on a strong showing. On the other side, Khrushchev is, over there thinking, hot diggity dog. Like, this guy has demonstrated that he is kind of a pushover. And in fact, Khrushchev then takes the strategic choice to be as aggressive and, kind of probing as possible in his rhetorical tactics at Vienna based on that perception. So I think that is also really important to keep in mind. Even if it doesn't directly affect outcome, reputations affect the bargaining process itself.
I think that's a really important insight, and it really is helpful in trying to understand when we see, especially a lot of the posturing from Kim Jong-un or the posturing with Trump and European leaders, because that posturing is not cheap talk as it is so often dismissed. It is almost a sociological ritual about how they interact with each other.
I want to put in a plug for one thing that I was not able to look into in the book, just in terms of, making sure it didn't get too bloated. And that is the importance of the role of gender in all of this. There have been some really fantastic work that has come out recently, including work by Abigail Post, about the relationship between gendered perceptions and crisis bargaining, international conflict. And I think that for scholars out there who kind of looking to address these issues further, I really highly encourage continued work on that dimension as well.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And it also draws into play cross-cultural perceptions of gender roles that, now makes it a much more complex proceeding. It's already complex enough just dealing with it within a single culture, but you start moving across cultural lines there, and it's important, it's operating, and our explicit understanding of it seems to be somewhat limited.
Absolutely. And especially as we see more female leaders being elected to the highest office, I think absolutely this is something you hit the nail right on the head there about the intricacies of how these relationships play out.
So we've been talking with Professor Danielle Lupton. Her new book, Reputation for Resolve, How Leaders Signal Determination in International Politics, is available from Cornell University Press. It's also available on Amazon in a Kindle edition. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Doyle. This has been great fun. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about my work.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.